Why did I bring Germanische Heilkunde to the Philippines? Perhaps the better question is, why didn't I discover it sooner? That's a question I've asked myself many times. Germanische Heilkunde has been around since 1981. It's not a new body of knowledge, yet somehow, despite spending many years immersed in health, biohacking, and human potential, I had never come across it. Looking back, I understand why. The work didn't spread in the way many other health philosophies have. It was heavily suppressed. Its founder, Dr. Ricky Gerd Hammer, went through a lot of battles just to get it through. Living here in the Philippines, this knowledge was even further outside my world. It originated in Germany, and long before social media connected us globally, it simply wasn't something that naturally entered my sphere of awareness. Then something changed. As social media began connecting people across the world, information that had once been difficult to find slowly became more accessible. Around 2021, I started hearing more conversations around Germanische Heilkunde, then called German New Medicine. But it was especially after 2022, following the passing of Dr. Hammer's appointed teaching heir, Helmut Pilhar, that I noticed many more practitioners openly sharing their knowledge and educational resources. More people were studying the work through different academies, applying it within their own professions, and discussing it publicly. Whether they worked in children's health, family therapy, psychiatry, trauma, mental health, cancer support, coaching, or personal development, people were beginning to explore how these biological principles could help them better understand the human experience. And eventually, those conversations reached me. Looking back now, I don't see it as being late. I see it as arriving exactly when I was ready to understand it. Because when I finally discovered Germanische Heilkunde, I realized I wasn't simply learning another health system. I was discovering an entirely new way of looking at symptoms, an entirely new way of understanding human behavior, and perhaps most importantly, an entirely new way of seeing what it means to be human. When people first hear the term Germanische Heilkunde, they often ask me a simple question. What is it? For me, the simplest answer is this. Germanische Heilkunde is the study of the 5 biological laws of nature, laws that describe how the psyche, the brain, and the organs are interconnected through meaningful biological processes. I often describe it as psychobiological. Why? Every moment of our lives, our psyche is constantly interpreting the world around us. It is continually asking one fundamental question. Am I safe or am I in danger? That assessment happens automatically. We don't consciously choose it. It is part of our biological design. From the moment we are conceived throughout pregnancy, during birth, and through every experience of childhood and adulthood, our psyche is continually learning from the world around us. Every experience contributes to how we perceive life, how we understand ourselves, and how we respond to future situations. Over time, these experiences begin to shape something incredibly important. Our identity. Who am I? Where do I belong? How do people see me? Am I accepted? Am I valued? Do they like me? Am I safe with these people? Why don't they like me? These aren't merely philosophical questions. They become part of the biological lens through which we experience life. Our identity influences how we perceive the world, and that perception influences our biology. And according to Germanische Heilkunde, that biology is expressed through a meaningful relationship between the psyche, the brain, and the organs. One of the things I appreciated most about this framework was that it gave me a coherent way of understanding many of the patterns I had been observing for years in my own self and in my work with clients. Rather than seeing symptoms as isolated events, it invited me to ask a different question. What was the psyche experiencing? Because if the psyche is constantly evaluating danger and safety, then perhaps our biology is not acting randomly. Perhaps it is responding intelligently. That idea changed everything for me. It shifted my perspective away from seeing the body as something that fails us. Instead, I began to wonder whether the body might actually be following understandable biological principles that have always been there. We simply hadn't learned how to recognize them. And once I saw health through that lens, I could never quite look at the human body in the same way again. One of the most profound shifts that Germanische Heilkunde gave me was this simple question. What if our symptoms actually make sense? For most of my life, like many people, I was taught to think of symptoms as mistakes. Something had gone wrong. The body had malfunctioned. Our job was to get rid of the symptom as quickly as possible. But Germanische Heilkunde invited me to consider a completely different perspective. What if nature isn't making mistakes? What if the body isn't confused? What if every biological response has meaning? That question changed everything for me. According to Germanische Heilkunde, what we often call illness may actually represent meaningful biological programs that are helping us adapt, survive, and eventually become stronger. Nature doesn't waste energy. It doesn't create random chaos. Every system in nature has purpose. The human body is no different. When I began studying these biological laws, I started seeing symptoms through an entirely new lens. Instead of asking, why is my body doing this to me? I began asking, what is my body trying to tell me? That doesn't mean that symptoms are comfortable. Far from it. Healing often requires us to slow down. There can be fatigue, inflammation, there can be pain, there can be heat. There may be a period where we need to rest instead of push forward. But perhaps these experiences are not signs that the body is failing. Perhaps they are signs that the body is rebuilding. I often think about it like strengthening a weak link in a chain. Before something becomes stronger, the weak point has to be exposed. Sometimes it has to be broken down. Then it can be rebuilt with greater strength. When we recover from many illnesses, we often hear people say, my immunity is stronger now. That observation has always fascinated me. Perhaps nature intended that all along. Perhaps many healing processes are designed not simply to restore us to where we were before, but to help us emerge more resilient than we were before the challenge. To me, this reflects the extraordinary intelligence of nature. Nature isn't interested in perfection. Nature is interested in adaptation. It is interested in resilience. It is interested in helping living organisms survive, learn, and become more robust over time. This perspective also changed the way I experienced my own health challenges. Instead of seeing symptoms as enemies, I became curious. What was my biology trying to communicate? What adaptation was taking place? What lesson was nature inviting me to understand? These questions didn't make every experience easier, but they made every experience more meaningful. And once I began seeing the body as an intelligent partner rather than an adversary, I found myself approaching health with far more curiosity than fear. And that curiosity opened the door to an even deeper realization. If symptoms are meaningful, then perhaps the experiences that precede those symptoms are meaningful too. And that's where my attention turned next, to the role that our relationships play in shaping our biology. As I continued studying Germanische Heilkunde and working with my own clients, I began noticing a pattern that appeared over and over again. People would come to me with different diagnoses, different symptoms, life stories, different ages, different personalities. But underneath those differences, I kept seeing something remarkably similar. I began asking myself, what is the common thread? Through the lens of Germanische Heilkunde, I came to an observation that has profoundly influenced the way I work today. It seems to me that one of the greatest sources of human suffering is found in our relationships with our parents, our children, our spouses, our families, our communities, especially our relationship with ourselves. Again and again, I saw that when people no longer felt safe in their relationships, when they no longer felt seen, embraced, understood, protected, or that they truly belonged, their biology responded. And that realization changed me because I began to see that we are not simply biological beings. We are biosocial creatures. Nature designed us to live in relationship. We were never meant to survive alone. From the moment we are born, our nervous systems are shaped by connection. We learn who we are through our relationships. We develop our sense of safety through our relationships. Our perception of belonging is formed through our relationships. When those relationships feel secure, something remarkable happens. We can relax, we can grow, we explore, we become creative, we start to connect with each other and all life everywhere. But when those relationships become unsafe, or when we perceive them to be unsafe, our biology adapts. Looking back, I began realizing that many of the conflicts I was seeing weren't really about disease at all. They were about belonging. They were about mattering or not mattering. It was more about separation, rejection, betrayal, shame, feeling unseen. They were about not knowing where we belonged. That observation has influenced every part of my work. It also helped me understand something about our modern world. We have become incredibly connected through technology, yet many people have never felt more alone. We can have thousands of followers and still feel unseen. We can live in crowded cities and still feel disconnected. We can live in the same house as our family and still not feel emotionally safe. I don't believe human beings were designed for that. Nature made us to live in connection, to care for one another, to build each other up, to protect one another, not to continually compete, isolate, shame, or destroy one another. The more I understood Germanische Heilkunde, the more convinced I became that health is about far more than what happens inside the body. It is also about the quality of the relationships that surround us. Because perhaps one of the greatest forms of medicine is feeling that you truly belong. And once I began seeing the extraordinary importance of belonging, another question naturally emerged. If relationships shape our biology, then what kinds of relationships were we originally designed to have? If there is one concept within Germanische Heilkunde that has deeply transformed both my professional work and my personal life, it is the concept of the identity conflict. Before I discovered this work, I thought identity was primarily psychological. Questions like who am I? Where do I belong? How do other people see me? Do I matter? Am I enough? Seem like questions we explored through counseling, personal development, or spirituality. But Germanische Heilkunde invited me to consider something much deeper. What if our experience of identity also has a biological dimension? And that idea fascinated me. According to Germanische Heilkunde, specific conflict themes are associated with specific areas of the brain and with specific organs. One of those themes is identity, the ego. Suddenly, experiences that many of us have lived through began making much more sense to me. People who are bullied, who are laughed at, people who are humiliated, people who are rejected, people who feel like they don't fit in. Wondering whether they belong in their family, their workplace, their school, their community, or even in their own body. They can't be small experiences because for many people, they shape an entire lifetime. Identity isn't only about the labels we give ourselves. It's about mattering. It's about belonging. It's about knowing where we fit. It's about feeling accepted for who we are, being seen. And perhaps one of the deepest human fears is the fear that we don't belong anywhere at all. We feel isolated, abandoned, and rejected. One example that helped this concept become very real for me was a relationship that Germanische Heilkunde describes between identity conflict and conditions involving the rectal mucosa, such as hemorrhoids or anal fissures. Within this biological framework, these symptoms are associated with identity conflict. And sometimes, depending on laterality and handedness, the identity conflict can also trigger in the squamous epithelium lining of the digestive organs, such as the bile ducts, pancreatic ducts, the gallbladder, and the small curvature of the stomach. That doesn't mean that every person with hemorrhoids or with gastric issues has exactly the same story. Each person's experience is unique, but it does invite us to ask meaningful questions. Have I been feeling ashamed? Have I been questioning where I belong? Do I feel accepted? Do I feel seen? Why does my family keep laughing at me about this one thing over and over again? Why can they never forget that thing that I did that I am ashamed of? Am I struggling with how others perceive me? Those questions are often far more important than we realize. This concept has also become very personal for me. Identity conflict is one of the areas I continue working on in my own life. I can often recognize it when it has been activated. When I notice myself becoming overly concerned with how I'm perceived, when criticism affects me more deeply than I expect, when I feel misunderstood, when I feel like a victim. Those moments invite me to pause, not with judgment, but with curiosity and wonder. Because Germanische Heilkunde has taught me that awareness is the beginning of transformation. We cannot change what we do not recognize. The more I understood the identity conflict, the more compassion I developed, not only for myself, but for the people around me. Because every person you meet has a story. Every person has experienced moments of rejection, moments of shame, moments of wondering whether they belong or whether they're enough. And perhaps many of the behaviors that we judge most harshly are rooted in those invisible experiences. But identity is only one part of a family of conflicts called territorial conflicts. And these conflicts influence our families, our workplaces, our communities, and even entire nations. And understanding those conflicts completely changed the way I looked at human behavior. As I continued studying Germanische Heilkunde, another biological theme began to reveal itself over and over again: the concept of territory. At first, I thought territory simply meant land or physical space or things and objects, but I soon realized that as human beings, our sense of territory extends far beyond that. It is exactly like it is in the plant and animal kingdom. Our territory includes our home, our family, our children, our work, our reputation, our relationships, our possessions, could be even our time with our friends, our money. These all become part of what we instinctively feel responsible for protecting, even from our own loved ones. When we perceive that something important is being taken from us or threatened, we don't simply have an emotional reaction. According to Germanische Heilkunde, our biology responds. One of the emotions most closely associated with territorial conflict is anger. Before discovering this work, I often thought of anger as something people simply needed to control. But now I see it differently. Anger is not necessarily evidence that someone is a bad person. It is often a powerful biological impulse. The purpose is to help us defend what we believe is ours, to regain what feels like it has been lost, to restore what we perceive has been violated. And that doesn't mean every expression of anger is healthy or appropriate. Far from it. But understanding its biological purpose changed the way I viewed human behavior. I began asking a different question, not, why is this person so angry? But rather, What territory do they believe they are losing? Sometimes it's respect. It could be something in their marriage, something in their career, their financial security, their sense of belonging, simply the feeling that no one is listening. Perhaps you feel that someone is stealing your ideas, your projects, your words, and copying everything that's yours and appropriating everything for themselves and gaining benefit from it. These questions, they create compassion because once you understand what someone believes they are protecting, their behavior often begins to make much more sense. Germanische Heilkunde also helped me recognize these patterns in myself. Whenever I feel betrayed, whenever I feel deeply disrespected, whenever I feel that someone had crossed a boundary without my consent, I can often recognize that my own territorial conflict has been activated. And that awareness has been incredibly humbling. It reminds me that I am not separate from the biology I teach. I live it too. And I continue learning from it every day. As I began looking through this lens, I started seeing territorial conflicts everywhere, within families, within businesses, within friendships, within communities, even within nations. People fighting over land, money, politics, recognition, power, status, reputation, resources, stealing territory from others. When we only look at the behavior, we often become judgmental. But when we begin asking what the person is trying to protect, the conversation changes. We move from blame to understanding. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior or corrupt behavior. People are still responsible for the choices they make. But understanding the biology behind those behaviors allows us to approach them with greater wisdom and compassion. And perhaps nowhere is this more important than in our closest relationships. Because so many of the conflicts that divide families begin with two people who both feel that something precious is being threatened. Understanding that has completely transformed the way I approach conflict. It has also transformed the way I approach people. Beneath every angry reaction, there is often a frightened human being trying to protect something they deeply value. And that realization prepared me for one of the greatest gifts Germanische Heilkunde has ever given me. It helped me move beyond judgment and toward compassion. If I had to describe the greatest gift that Germanische Heilkunde has given me, it wouldn't be a better understanding of symptoms. It would be a better understanding of people. Before I discovered this work, I think I was like many of us. When someone behaved badly, when someone was cruel, manipulative, explosive, controlling, or difficult to love, it was easy to ask, what's wrong with them? But Germanische Heilkunde gradually taught me to ask a completely different question. What happened to them? That single question changed my life. Because once you begin looking through that lens, you start seeing that every behavior has a story. Every reaction has a history. Every survival strategy developed for a reason. One example that profoundly changed my thinking was how I began looking at narcissistic behavior. When clients would tell me, I'm married to a narcissist, or my parent is a narcissist, I stopped focusing only on the label. Instead, I became curious. What happened to this person? What experiences shaped them? Were they constantly criticized, bullied, humiliated, made to feel invisible, rejected? Did they spend years believing they were never enough? Through the lens of Germanische Heilkunde, I began to understand that what we often see on the outside may be someone's attempt to survive something that happened long ago. Again, that doesn't excuse harmful behavior. People are responsible for the choices that they make. But understanding where those behaviors may come from changes how we respond. It replaces judgment with curiosity, blame with compassion, condemnation with understanding. And perhaps the greatest surprise was that this compassion didn't stop with other people. It came back to me. Because as I continued studying these biological principles, I began recognizing my own survival patterns. I could see my own identity conflicts. I could recognize when my territorial conflicts had been activated. I could feel the impulse to defend myself, to prove myself, to protect what mattered to me. And there were moments when I realized I'm not reacting because I'm irrational. I'm reacting because my biology believes something important is being threatened. And that awareness didn't make me perfect. Far from it. I still have much to learn, and I still catch myself becoming defensive. I still notice when criticism affects me more than I would like. I still recognize moments when I feel misunderstood or betrayed. But today, instead of judging myself, I become curious. What am I protecting? What perception is my psyche responding to? What is my biology trying to help me survive? In many ways, I have become my own case study. The more I understand myself, the more grace I have for others. And the more grace I have for others, the more I understand myself. That has been one of the most unexpected gifts of this journey. Compassion doesn't really begin by changing other people. It begins by understanding ourselves. And when enough people begin living with that kind of understanding, families begin to change, communities begin to change, perhaps even society begins to change. That realization led me to ask even a bigger question. If human beings are biologically designed for connection, then what kind of environment allows us to truly flourish? As my understanding of Germanische Heilkunde continued to grow, another realization slowly began to emerge. If so many of our biological conflicts are rooted in our relationships, then perhaps the solution isn't simply understanding those conflicts. Perhaps we also need to understand the kind of environment human beings were designed to grow in. The question eventually led me to the science of the evolved nest. When I first discovered it, I immediately saw how beautifully it complemented everything I had been learning through Germanische Heilkunde. GH helped me understand why so many conflicts arise. The evolved nest helped me understand how we can create environments where fewer of those conflicts need to arise in the first place. To me, they answered two different but equally important questions. Germanische Heilkunde asks, what happened? The evolved nest asks, what kind of environment helps human beings thrive? That was a profound shift in my thinking, because I realized that health isn't simply about treating symptoms. It isn't even only about understanding biology. It is also about creating conditions where the biology can flourish. And the evolvedness is based on decades of interdisciplinary research into human development, neuroscience, anthropology, psychology, and our evolutionary history. It asks a remarkably simple question. How did nature expect human beings to raise children, build families, and care for one another? The answers are surprisingly consistent. Human beings flourish when they experience nurturing relationships, responsive caregiving, play, affection, community, acceptance, safety, belonging. As I reflected on my own work, I realized that these were the very things that many of my clients had been missing. Not because anybody really intended harm, who does that? But rather because modern life has gradually disconnected us from many of the environments that help human beings thrive throughout our evolutionary history. We have become more productive, more efficient, more technologically connected. But many people feel less emotionally connected than ever before. And that has consequences. If our biology is continually asking, am I safe? Then the environment around us matters profoundly. Families matter, communities matter. The way we communicate matters. The way we raise children matters. The way we respond to one another matters. Every interaction either contributes to a greater sense of safety or to a greater sense of threat. When I became a Nested World Ambassador, It wasn't because I wanted to leave Germanische Heilkunde behind. It was because I wanted to complete the picture. For me, these two bodies of knowledge fit together beautifully. One helps us understand the biological meaning behind conflict. The other helps us intentionally build environments that support healthier nervous systems, healthier relationships, and healthier communities. That is the vision that now inspires my work. Not simply helping people understand why symptoms happen, but helping create a world where future generations experience fewer of the conflicts that give rise to them. Because perhaps the greatest form of prevention isn't found in another treatment. Perhaps it begins by creating homes, families, schools, and communities where people genuinely feel safe, loved, and that they belong. That has become one of the deepest hopes of my work. And it naturally leads to one final question. What does all this mean for us here in the Philippines? Once you begin seeing human behavior through this lens, you begin seeing our entire society differently. People often ask me, why are you so passionate about bringing Germanische Heilkunde to the Philippines? And the answer is actually much bigger than Germanische Heilkunde itself. Because once I began seeing human biology through this lens, I stopped seeing isolated illnesses. I started seeing patterns, relationships, families, communities, and eventually, I started seeing society. Today, when I look around our country, I don't simply see political disagreements. I don't simply see family conflicts. I don't simply see people arguing on social media. I see millions of human beings trying to protect what they believe is important. I see identity. I see territory. I see belonging. I see fear. I see people desperately trying to feel seen, respected, valued, and safe. Sometimes those survival programs bring out the very best in us. Courage, protection, leadership, sacrifice. But sometimes those same survival programs express themselves through division, anger, blame, polarization, violence. And when we only judge the behavior, we often miss the biology that may be driving it. That realization has changed the way I look at our country. It has also changed the question I ask. Instead of asking, how do we fix people? I now ask, how do we create environments where people don't have to spend their lives surviving? I believe that this is where true prevention begins, not simply by treating disease, but by nurturing the conditions that allow health to emerge naturally. This is why my work eventually expanded beyond Germanische Heilkunde. This also led me to expand beyond biohacking, where I first had to understand how we replenish energy to support our biology. It led me to the polyvagal theory and understanding the biology of safety. It led me to the science of the evolved nest and how human beings were designed to grow, connect, and thrive. Each of these disciplines answered a different piece of the same question. How do we become more fully human? How do we create healthier families? How do we help children grow up feeling safe enough that fewer survival conflicts need to develop in the first place? How do we build communities where people feel that they truly belong? That has become my mission. Not simply helping people understand symptoms, but helping people understand themselves, helping parents understand their children, helping couples understand one another, helping communities move from judgment toward compassion, helping adult children understand their parents when they were children, helping people recognize that health is not only something we build inside the body, it's also something we build between one another. I don't believe we are here merely to survive. I believe we are here to flourish, to reconnect with our biology, to reconnect with one another, and ultimately to reconnect with the laws of nature that have quietly guided human life all along. This journey has transformed me. It made me less afraid of symptoms and more curious about biology, more compassionate toward people, more aware of my own patterns, and more hopeful than ever before. If human beings can learn to understand themselves differently, then we can learn to relate with one another differently. If we relate differently, families change. If families change, communities change. And if communities change, nations change. That is the future I believe is possible. And that is why I have dedicated my life to bringing these ideas to the Philippines. I don't expect everybody to agree with me. I simply hope to invite more people into a conversation rooted in curiosity rather than certainty, in compassion rather than judgment, and in the belief that perhaps the human body and the human spirit are far more intelligent than we have ever imagined. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I hope it's only the beginning. I'm not asking you to believe everything I've shared. In fact, I encourage you to study it for yourself. Read widely, ask questions, stay curious. My hope isn't that you adopt my perspective. My hope is that you begin looking at yourself, your loved ones, and even your symptoms with a little more curiosity and a little less fear. That's where my own journey began, and it has completely changed my life. Welcome to Germanische Heilkunde, Philippines.